This is a very historic meeting, and it's being live streamed as well. We want to welcome Dr. Abdul Al-Kalimat to the Temple University Department of Africology and African American Studies. And we welcome you here, Dr. Al-Kalimat. You are one of the founders of the field of Black Studies, and we are very delighted to have you here. And we want to apologize for not even having you earlier. We have an outstanding
I think you're on mute.
Muted, Dr. Asante.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have, we're very happy to have you here. We've graduated about 200 PhDs. We are a major factor in the field of Black Studies and Africology. We see ourselves as advancing the discipline. We believe that we have evolved in many ways, and we see that the evolution has provided us with an epistemic basis for examining phenomena from the standpoint of African agency. So we're very, very pleased because we have an outstanding faculty of 11 faculty members, and we just heard today we have 27 doctoral students that are in the program right now, with about 10 additional students who are writing dissertations. So they've been introduced to you. They know your work. You are, of course, the professor emeritus from the University of Illinois, where you also led for us the Afro net, and you have also, of course, written many articles and at least 5, I've counted, books, including the latest book, The History of Black Studies. And I don't know whether you can see it on my screen, but The History of Black Studies, Abdul Al-Kalimat. I've known you for probably 50 years as I think back, because if my memory is correct, you were the founder of the People's College, as well as probably the leading African American scholar in the area of cyberspace. And you started that before anybody. So your work in the School of Library and Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, as well as African American Studies, your work is a legacy to brilliance and to excellence. So we appreciate you for all that you have done for this field. In fact, if it had not been for you, we would have had to create somebody like you, because you've basically kept the community together, and we appreciate that. You've kept this community together by sharing information with everyone. Most people don't realize, but you grew up in Chicago, so you've sort of been an Illinois person for a long time. You grew up in Chicago. You even went to school at the University of Chicago, got your PhD from the University of Chicago. And if I recall, I may be wrong, for a while, I think you taught at Fisk. But that was years ago when I was still in the West Coast at UCLA, and you used to travel. I think it was almost every week we had you to do a special class at UCLA on France Fanon. And I remember that. That was either in the late 60s or the early 70s. But we're just happy today. I mean, our faculty, our students, we're very happy and delighted to have you in our presence. And we know this would be a historic day. So we're going to open it up to you, Dr. Al-Kalimat, to probably speak to us for 40 minutes. And then maybe if you have, you want to let us ask questions, some of our people will ask questions. But you You can talk to us about the history of Black studies or any aspect of Black studies. We just want to hear you. We just think it's important for us to know what you do and who you are. Thank you very much, Dr. Alcalamath.
Thank you so much for that, that generous introduction. I'm going to share my screen because my presentation will be with a PowerPoint. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, as I said, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to talk about the history of Black studies, and by so doing, try to make the case that this history is an important subject for faculty and students in Black studies. Really, it's just part of why history in general is an important subject, because without history, there can be no understanding of right now, no real understanding of culture, no consciousness of who we are, and on that basis, who we can be, our future selves and the future of society. The past, present, and future are all connected. And you can consider this presentation an introduction to my recently published book, The History of Black Studies. And the slide can still be seen?
Yes.
Okay, good. The general context for any discussion of the Black experience is the special oppressive conditions Black people have faced. In our own unique way, the special oppression condition faced by Africans in the Americas, in our case, the USA. Racism is what we can call it, the general imposition of the structures and ideologies of European supremacy, the beatdown, the exploitation, the discrimination in all institutions of society. And yes, this has special meaning for us in the area of knowledge production. White supremacy controls mainstream rules and determines what is ethical, and brute force has often maintained control over schooling. So in a fundamental way, when we say Black studies, we are advancing an anti-racist action that is part of the freedom struggle. So we will be dealing with 5 basic questions. First, what is Black studies? We need a conceptual framework. Next, we will look at 3 fundamental ways that Black studies has existed historically. Black studies as intellectual history on campus and in the community. Black studies as educational programs in our social movements. And then Black studies as academic profession, what we are doing on our campuses today. And finally, we will reflect on the future of Black studies. Now, the origin of intellectual reflection on our experience as Black people goes back to the beginning, as this reference to Egypt suggests. But in this presentation, my focus is on the last 150 years. We begin with a conceptual framework. Our goal, as will be made clear, is to be inclusive and respectful of our diversity in thinking and acting. Black studies includes those activities, 1, that study and teach about African Americans, including Africans and other African descendant people. 2, where Black people themselves are the main agents or protagonists of the study and learning. 3, that counter racism and contribute to human liberation. 4, that celebrate the Black experience. And 5, Black studies presents an analysis of the economics, cultures, and politics of the American hemisphere in Western Europe from the perspective of people of African descent. In sum, what we study, who studies, defense of our people, how we feel about it and celebrate it all, and why this is part of our universal human mission. So I'm going to be talking about these 5 aspects of what we're calling Black studies. Now, our guiding intentionality through the conceptual framework is summed up by the mission of the National Council of Black Studies: academic excellence and social responsibility, a subject I will make several references to. But for now, the question is, where do we get our standards of excellence? In Black studies, the answer is clear. We don't get them uncritically from our academic institutions, still tainted with the blood-soaked racism of past so-called scholarship. We get them from the giants of Black intellectual history. The preeminent model for the 20th century, of course, is W.E.B. Du Bois. Here on this slide, he is at many phases of his life, from Fisk University, where he went to college initially, through Harvard, through the NACP, into his most senior years in Ghana. Du Bois shows us that we don't have to limit ourselves. His work included qualitative and quantitative studies. He's regarded as a historian and a sociologist, while having published novels and poetry. He wrote for newspapers and journals, and his audience included scholars, the reading public, as well as the children. I don't have to tell you about all of these qualities of excellence here at Temple, as you have as your example, your professor, Malife Asante. And I remember those various experiences you discussed when I flew out to UCLA. Yeah. You know, I think I even met you at a conference at the University of Illinois.
Absolutely.
That's where we first met.
Absolutely.
But remember, while Du Bois was a man of reason, he cautioned us to remember the findings of Freud and Marx, so that we take note of the irrational that is so much a part of human behavior, and the role of power and political economy of class as a dominant force in society. Now, in addition to the Du Bois model for excellence, Black scholars have maintained a record of their scholarship, as demonstrated by this slide. This record demonstrates that Black scholars were conscious of the value of their work, and it proves the lie to the racist view that Black scholars were not productive and worthy of being included in mainstream journals and the curriculum of the top schools. These materials include sources based in academic institutions, as well as sources most closely related to movements for social justice. This comparison is clear when the Journal of Negro Education, based at Howard, is included alongside Freedom Ways and the Ames newsletter, both run by members of the Communist Party. So this slide indicates, and you can see the years, that at every year, the last 100 years, it was possible to see extensive bibliographies of scholarship that constitutes the foundation on which we do our work today. So every student in Black studies at some time needs to put your hands on these materials and anchor your thinking about the Black experience and what has been done by the generation of scholars that have preceded you. In fact, making a bibliography should be a fundamental method employed by every student and scholar. And in this slide, every one of those items that has an asterisk, they're online. And so it's easily accessible particularly through on-campus access through your library. You should be able to look at those bibliographies very easily. Now, Black studies as intellectual history begins with its institutional base in the historically Black colleges and universities, what are called HBCUs, because institutional racism excluded Black scholars from mainstream jobs. Now, one major example is Howard University, as illustrated by this slide here. When Mordecai Johnson became the first Black president of Howard in 1926, he built a faculty of leading Black scholars of that time. And this slide tells an interesting story. First, these scholars got degrees at the most elite schools, but were excluded from working for them. Harvard, University of Chicago, Columbia, etc. Now, once hired at Howard, they stayed, making Howard a center of excellent Black scholarship for those decades. This ranged from 1890 to to the end of the 1960s for these people, 4 generations. And you could just imagine how many students came through this highly elite, highly productive faculty, covering all these various areas of study. And in many ways, this is a challenging standard for the current faculty in HBCUs and every other institution as well. Now at HBCUs, the initial curriculum was modeled on the same Eurocentric curriculum dominant in the mainstream at that time. You can see this curriculum of 1920s at Fisk. Same was true at Howard, etc. They were required to take years of Greek and Latin. Students were being prepared to replicate in a segregated context mainstream goals for being educated. This was not without value, as this literature is central to world history, but without the Black experience as a framework and perspective, Eurocentrism would be just another form of forced assimilation through self-negation. Here's the example at Fisk, placing students in the context of the literature of ancient Greece and Rome. One of the first major battles to create Black studies was how to transform the curriculum. That occurred at the HBCUs. This is where the initial struggle took place. And this battle was won. Black schools, beginning with Fisk 20 years later, they were able to start African studies programs at the college level in the US. Contrary to the notion that this was done by Melville Herskovits at Northwestern University in 1948, African studies at the college level was started at Fisk University, an HBCU, 1943. Black scholars were in the lead on studying the Black experience. Note the focus on language, preparing students to engage with on-the-ground African experience, also the focus on religion. So major developments were taking place on campus. There was also Black studies being developed in the community. Now, one of the great community institutional developments was the Black bookstore. Here's an example from Harlem, the National Memorial African Bookstore. The owner, Louis Michaud, was a de facto professor of Black studies in his store, which he called the House of Common Sense and the Home of Proper Propaganda. People called him the professor. The store was a national treasure. And from 1931 to 1968, Michaud served the community with books and pamphlets created by Black scholars and activists. Of course, such bookstores were set up everywhere. Vaughn's in Detroit, Ellis in Chicago, and we had Timbuktu in Nashville. Every activist in the Black liberation movement went to these bookstores, like people go to an oasis in the desert. I can attest to this, as I was a graduate student and went to visit Michaud at his bookstore, and then around the corner to the Frederick Douglass bookstore on the second floor that was opened by Richard Moore in 1942 on West 125th Street in Harlem. You can see Michaud in the upper right-hand corner holding up that pamphlet by Malcolm X. He took me in the basement and he had copies of Ghana Reconstructs, which was a magazine that Nkrumah put out that was modeled after China Reconstructs. Fascinating experience. Now, the Black movement, again, based in the community, developed key ideologies. And we can see from these familiar faces, or at least they should be familiar to everybody, connected to these ideologies: Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker, Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Now, Black people have been represented by a tradition of beliefs and practices designed to advance the cause of Black liberation. What we have always done since slavery days, called the fight for freedom. And I'd like you to consider the following 5 ideological tendencies that are fundamental to this process: Pan-Africanism, nationalism, liberation theology, feminism, or as Alice Walker would call it, womanism, and socialism. Often these are viewed as static dogma, but in reality, they have been dynamic concerns shared by the same people at the same time. This has been true of most of the people shown here. Take Malcolm, for example. One could argue that he embraced all in his own way, not for all time. Obviously, he was developing his perspective. He was a dynamic process in motion. So if looking at him during the last years of his life, all 5 tendencies show up in his thinking and practice. Students in Black studies are best served when they study all 5 and key figures in each historical context so they can best understand the situation in which they live. This will anchor you in Black studies as intellectual history. Again, the HBCUs, the community, and the movement. Now, the second basic way we're looking at Black studies is as a function of education in our social movements. In the post-World War II period, we can clearly point out the second context to understand the history of Black studies as social movement. We've identified these 6 movements. The freedom movement, what then was called the civil rights movement, but was in our community always referred to as the freedom movement, Black power movement, the Black arts movement, the new communist movement, Black women's movement, and the Black student movement. Each movement has had educational programs, both for the masses of people and for cadre development to provide leadership. Now, these are what I call emergent institutions that develop within these social movements. In other words, an organizational structure that developed rules, that developed roles, that developed curriculum, that developed a program. In the freedom movement, the freedom schools spread first throughout the South and then nationally. The segregated schools in the South were silent on the Black experience, except to argue that the Southern plantocracy was benevolent and that Black people should be grateful for their becoming Americans. In other words, slavery wasn't all that bad. Freedom schools brought a Black perspective and turned this racist history on its head. These schools covered all ages and in some cases included literacy training, home economics, and health. There were also freedom libraries set up, thus making books an active resource for building the freedom movement. The Black Power movement drew much strength from its central icon, Malcolm X, seen here on this slide in the upper left-hand corner. After a fight against institutional racism at Duke University in North Carolina, community activists led by Owusu Sadoki joined the Duke students to form the Malcolm X Liberation University, a Black Power emergent Black studies institution. They built into the curriculum both theoretical reflection on the Black global experience and a basic skills program that would prepare the students to work on the ground, making a practical contribution to an autonomous program of self-determination for liberation. As an emergent institution, Malcolm X Liberation University would stay alive for a short time, but would remain as a symbol for all independent efforts to build an educational program from scratch in the community. Another example of a Black Power movement emergent institution is the East, that was based in Brooklyn, New York. Its program was anchored in cultural activities. They formed an elementary level school, Uhuru Sasa Shule, Kiswahili for Freedom Now School. And their central figure in leading this is J2 Weusi, as you see his picture there several times, who came out of being a teacher in New York and subsequently then set up this independent educational process. They also published a journal, the Black News, that served to inform and contribute to curriculum material. Now, the main carrier, I think, for the ideological content of Black Power was the Black arts movement. otherwise called BAM, Black Arts Movement. Every art genre was involved all across the country. The musicians, the painters, the photographers, the dancers, the theater folks, and the writers. They held conferences, created journals, and built organizations. Here in this slide, you see Barbara Ann Teer, the lead person in founding the National Black Theater in Harlem, New York. And next to her is an issue of the journal Black Theater. This movement touched every community and led to art being embraced by the masses of people. Poetry was no longer for special people. It became something that most activists saw as an expression of their creativity. Freedom meant poetry should come out of everyone's mouth, and it did. And you see it being recreated today, this turning poetry into performance poetry as opposed to an academic exercise, which is what poetry had become in this country. In many narratives of the Black liberation movement, and certainly in the Black studies movement, there's a silence about the ideological and practical leadership of Black workers, the majority of Black people, and associated with them left perspectives. This makes the intellectual activity of Black people seem like a middle-class activity. Nothing could be further from the truth, unless, of course, one ignores the community and only looks at institutions whose role is to nurture and accommodate the middle class, like the university. Now, this slide counters that argument, focusing on the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. They formed the RUM movement, R-U-M, Revolutionary Union Movement, R-U-M, standing for things like DRUM. That stood for Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or FRUM, the Ford Revolutionary Union Movement, UPRUM, United Parcel Revolutionary Union Movement. These were independent organizations within each of those industries. These workers created a bookstore, a publishing company, a lecture series built around a reading program, and ran a newspaper. They educated the people of Detroit, and their message traveled to all parts of the country and stimulated Black worker organizations until the current struggles today still reflect on that. Now, on the right side, you see a brother whose name is General Baker. Yeah, that's his real name, General Baker. His mama named him General. You know, that was a wonderful thing. That sent that brother on a mission. He was an auto worker who became the leading voice in the Black working class based in Detroit and really throughout the country. And here's another case making silence no longer a viable narrative. Black women rose up and began to find their voice and role in self-organizing, to find a way to make the fight for women's rights and an end to patriarchy part of the necessary program for Black liberation. The women in SNCC, and then some of them pulled other third world women together and they formed the Third World Women's Alliance. Their newspaper, Triple Jeopardy, was essential reading and really courageously opened up people's eyes to the exploitation of women. One of their leaders in the upper left hand on this slide is Fran Beal. On the right is the feminist leader of the lesbian tendency, the writer Audre Lorde. Of course, a decisive movement for the breakthrough creation of Black studies in mainstream academic institutions is the Black student movement. The emergent institution for this movement was the BSU, the Black Student Union. At first, Black students had to form their own study groups so that they could supplement their formal classes with what became known as Black Studies curriculum, especially such key figures as Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, Carter G. Woodson, W.B. Du Bois, E. Franklin Frazier, and the writers, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, and many others. When the students confronted institutional racism, it was not an easy experience. Militant action brought violent repression, but the students persevered and forced change. Seen here, there are two examples. On the left is a student strike at San Francisco State, which was the longest such strike in US history. This led to the first Black Studies program in a mainstream institution. And on the right is the protest at Cornell University. So we've covered both Black studies as intellectual history and Black studies as social movement. So now we come to its main manifestation today, Black studies as academic profession. Each institution has its own particular history, and that is a narrative that must be documented. So I ask you, has the historical narrative of Black studies at Temple University been documented, organized in a volume that can be studied? This is an urgent project while the founding generation is still alive and available for interviews. If you take, for example, the slave narratives, students at Fisk and other places were able to interview people who had, in fact, experienced slavery. These documents represent a fundamental foundation of knowledge about the slave experience. We have the responsibility of telling the story of Black studies, one of the greatest advances of the Black Power period. Almost 400 degree-granting programs exist in the United States, and each institution has a story to tell. And each institution's history should be preserved. All the directors, all the curriculum, all the struggles that took place are important part of our memory that must be preserved. On the other hand, we have identified 6 aspects of the historical development of Black studies as academic professions as a general model that can be used to organize the particularity, the story of each institution. Social disruption, building consensus, building institutions, establishing the profession, theorizing, norming research. Now, first, the best data to refute the disaster view that Black studies is in decline, which used to be talked about every year, is a graph of Black studies degrees granted over time. This is data from the National Center for Educational Statistics from 2019. In 1987, there were 156 bachelor's degrees, 25 master's degrees, and 3 PhDs. By 2017, 30 years later, there were 671 bachelor's degrees, 66 master's degrees, and 32 PhDs granted. Black studies, in fact, then, is an official part of mainstream higher education. This was not achieved by academic achievement alone. The first phase was dominated by struggle, including building takeovers, then a national debate to clarify the content of the field so that formal proposals could be navigated through the local decision-making structures of faculty governance. All of this had led to the professionalization of the field. Now, part of this professionalization of the field is the granting of the PhD, which of course, Temple is a lead example of in the country. There's a diversity of organizational structure for these degrees, especially the PhDs. In this slide, you can see the 3 main types. The fully independent programs, Temple, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, et cetera. Those that are partnering really jointly with another academic profession, like at Yale or Penn State, or not official degree, but a certificate, a recognition of taking courses or meeting some smaller set of requirements, such as at the University of Illinois or University of California at Santa Barbara. Another aspect of the professionalization is a professional organization. Older ones like the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, founded by Carter G. Woodson in 1915, or the National Council for Black Studies, founded in 1975, or the African American Intellectual History Society, founded in 2014. The critical function of these organizations is to promote collectivity of the activists in the field, setting standards for what is called peer review, standards that Black studies professionals impose on each other as peers in the field, maintaining, again, academic excellence. Professionalization was also achieved by the development of professional journals. Where the scholars in the field could publish their peer-reviewed research. In 1981, I published a volume titled Guide to Scholarly Journals in Black Studies. The introduction noted the reason for making sure these journals were important. Academic recognition is based on productivity and research and publishing in scholarly journals. Black scholars have been excluded from mainstream academic journals. Therefore, journals in Black studies should be fully recognized as legitimate outlets for professional scholarship. Students and faculty in Black studies have these as their journals, not to exclude other journals from other disciplines, but these are our primary sources. These journals carry our empirical research and our theoretical studies. Now we have theory in Black studies. Diverse scholars have created a treasure trove of theoretical reflection about specific experience, as well as viewing the Black experience in general, historical and global in its reach. Some have used the concept paradigm instead of theory. I've made a very general conceptual distinction between Afrocentrism and Black experientialism. Now, Afrocentrism takes a macro historical and comparative approach, creating an alternative to the fundamentals of Western Eurocentric thinking by choosing to seek origins in Egypt rather than Greece or Rome. There's also a concern for transgenerational continuity, and comparative similarity across the African diaspora. Here I have pictured Maulana Karenga, Linda James Myers, Amma Mazama, and Malife Asante as outstanding examples of this theoretical tendency. Now, Black experientialism starts its focus on some specific aspect of the African-American experience and makes theoretical reflection on its more immediate historical development and impact on the present and the future. This breaks down in the case of what I'm calling the idealist and the materialist, mainly Marxists. Here I identify Michelle Alexander, Henry Louis Gates, Gerald Horne, and Barbara Ransby. Too often, these theoretical models are pitted against each other. I've chosen a different approach, one of unity. Here we have a table of theoretical spaces, with each line being an abstraction that may or may not make sense to isolate an experience. But what it does do is enable us to compare and contrast any given set of theoretical reflections on some aspect or aspects of the Black experience. Will differences exist? Of course. The value is that when we can identify and understand different ways of thinking about our actual experience, we will all be more wise and more understanding of the diverse set of views that have been present in Black intellectual history. This is not a history we can imagine. It's what our actual intellectual history has been. And our understanding of that is a critical way in which we can, in fact, make the best contribution to the need for understanding by our people in general. We have needed a paradigm of unity. So for example, take the slave trade, that column. There are ways to understand the slave trade using any of these four or a relationship of these four. For example, race would mean all Black people. Nationality would focus on specific people. Where did the people from Angola go? Where did the people from different parts of Africa go? And what were the language realities, the linguistic and cultural realities, the religious realities of that? And then, of course, the question of class. You know, who were the people who were abducted into slavery and who were the ones who didn't or who cooperated? In other words, each one of these variables makes a contribution, but any given scholar may focus on one versus the other. Black studies is always moving forward. And I would now like to comment on two aspects of the future. First is diaspora studies. One way is for us to look around the world and study the similarities and differences between the Black experience in the US and some other place. The really exciting new developments include the way in which the study of the Black experience is being taken up in other parts of the world. In other words, when we started Black studies in this country, the Black Power movement in particular, that really set off a dynamic that spread throughout the world. In Europe, in South America, in Africa itself, new stages of self-realization and study began to take place. Now, in this slide, we see the culture of hair being exhibited on the left from Philadelphia and on the right from South Africa. I just love the attitude of the people from Philadelphia. Temple is in Philadelphia. That's why I'm using this picture. When we examine this, what becomes clear is that in the US, we study most of the African countries and Caribbean countries. But what's interesting is they have yet to study us. So there is no African American studies program in Africa. That's something we have to look forward to in the future. The second major trend is how information technology is transforming how we do Black studies, research, teaching, and community service. Now, I call this e-Black studies. We know email, we know e-commerce. Now we know e-Black studies. In this slide, you can see how computers and the internet have changed our behavior. It's impacted our professional discourse, our teaching, our research, how we impact public policy and our community service. Now on the right here, you see this is something that I developed in 1997, 25 years ago, when I was teaching at the University of Toledo. But a lot has happened since then. For example, here I am lecturing on Zoom. So this is all normal now. There's much more to come. But given all of the technological devices that are constantly changing, we need a general methodological approach to our digital transformation. I'm calling this the D7 method. There's 7 aspects to this. First, the definition. What is the research question? Again, this has always been true. What are we interested in finding out? Secondly, what material is being studied? What is the data? What is the stuff we're using to make our arguments, to make our analysis? But now we enter something new. Digitization, moving it from the concrete to the digital. This, of course, creates all kinds of possibilities. We can collaborate, we can save, we can handle large bodies of data, we can do many, many things. And of course, with the new developments, we're going to be able to translate documents, so we won't be in language prisons as much as we have been. For example, most of us are unaware of the literature in French or in Spanish or in German or in Zulu or in Hausa. And this new technology is going to enable us to begin to access all of that. Then discovery, that is what we come up with. What is our analysis? What is our result? What is our finding? Design. This is a very important aspect because what we're talking about here is how do you then format? What format are you using to present your findings? A book is different from an article that would be in an anthology. It's different than an article that would go into a journal. Every journal has its own specifications. It's different if you're making a presentation to the community or at a conference. So the design, then the distribution. In other words, how do you get people your desired audience? And then finally, making a difference. Because remember, academic excellence and social responsibility is not just a question of academic scholarship. It's also a question of the utility of your scholarship for your community. That is, being responsible to the needs of your community. Now, all research has dealt with all of this except digitization. But with that, the entire process is transformed, including data, which is sometimes actually now born digitally. For example, you might be studying Twitter, you might be studying email, you might be studying documents that have been created digitally. With this e-Black Studies methodology, we can march into the 21st century academic world with professional excellence and, as I would like to put it, a very hip way of doing it. So thank you. That's my presentation. I'm anxiously awaiting your comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Al-Kalamat. And if you want to, we can, I think your screen, we're still sharing your screen, but I'm sure there are comments or questions from the audience. And if you can figure out how to, there you go, beautiful. Okay. So now, if you have Jasmine, are you still with us? Okay, if you have a
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, so you want to handle the questions for us?
Yes, not a problem. So if you do have a question for our speaker, please drop them in the chat and we will ask them or get them answered.
In the meantime, while they are doing that, I just want to really commend Professor Al-Kalamat for his presentation. It was a very tight presentation, well done in his tradition. And the book, by the way, which I have started reading, is extremely helpful and useful for all of you who are in our program, because what this means is that you will have a very clear understanding of some of the very origins of the field. And I don't think anyone has done this for us so well at this time as Professor Al-Kalamat. I just want to say just one correction. We at Temple, we don't use the word Afrocentrism because that seems to be more religious or ideological. We always use Afrocentricity, and I'm sure before anybody asks you that question, I thought I would just clarify that for you. But we now have some comments, and so who is first? You unmute yourself and then ask the question. Is that Freddie?
There's a question here from what's a famous quote in Black Studies? Boy, what, I'm almost at a loss for words. There's so many famous quotes. I often think about Malcolm talking about think for yourself. Study everything, but think for yourself. I think we really need what happened in the 60s. There was an explosion of free thinking. And this partly was expressed in poetry. This partly was expressed in people just talking to each other. I mean, you could go into a barbershop, you go anywhere, and people were talking about important issues. It wasn't just baseball or football or basketball. It was about freedom. It was about Africa. It was about, the Caribbean. People were really exploring the freedom of talking about our condition. The whole history of racism was to silence people. And so I think in Black Studies, what we have to do, it really is empower our students to think for themselves and to make sure that they go out and they study as much material as possible and then debate among themselves, not just in our classrooms where we as faculty stand in as authority figures, et cetera, but amongst themselves. I know our experience was that study groups was where we learned most. So.
Very good. Excellent.
We have another question, but it was asked privately. What do you foresee the future of Black studies being? And then also, do you foresee any issues that might, arise?
Well, I think Black studies has, aside from the actual, what I said in my talk about diaspora and technology, I think there are really two tendencies. One tendency is to become part of what's happening in higher education in general. In some instances, there's a lot of money. There's some people who make a lot of money as an academic, and money tends to draw a certain kind of behavior to conform to institutional norms and public policy. On the other hand, there's a connection of Black studies to the community and to movements for freedom. And I think in most of our campuses, both tendencies exist. In other words, when struggle occurs, students and aspects of our campus respond to that struggle. On the other hand, there are people on our campuses that are part of the administration, that see institutional maintenance as the main aspect. So there's this struggle that goes on. I think that we have to accept that reality in the mainstream institutions, but it's the connection to the movement that is our best way of creating the future that is transformative, that creates something new, not just the institutional maintenance of doing what is acceptable on our college campuses. But that's advice from the origin of Black studies. We created it through struggle. And the only way it's going to continue is through struggle.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another private question. I think you may have already answered this a little bit, but what do you say to scholars who are in Black studies that don't necessarily have a emphasis on community work, that they just want to keep their scholarship within the academy?
Well, there are really two answers to that question. I mean, on the one hand, all knowledge production should be protected. And so I don't think I'm against, sort of knowledge police, trying to dictate to somebody what they might be interested in. But on the other hand, even with that, each of us has a relationship to our students and to our community. So whatever you're studying, there's also a relationship to your community and to your students. And therefore, in a classroom, you're doing two things. You're teaching your subject, but you're also teaching people who are going to go out and lead their lives in the society, and you have that responsibility. So I would want to help mentor people who have come out of various programs who are, without basically understanding this necessarily, living in the privilege of the siloing of academic practice, as opposed to understanding that there is a responsibility. I mean, it's like you're a parent, you're responsible to your kids. As a person in a community, you're responsible to the community. It's just like wearing a mask during a pandemic. I mean, people talk about they have the personal, no, it ain't about no personal. You got to wear it because it is a responsibility of protecting the community. So I think that anybody who doesn't see the community needs some help.
Okay.
Great answer. One more question. This is actually coming from Olivia Patton, who is a student within the Department of Africology. She says, do you believe the decline of enrollment in higher degrees in Black studies can be partly attributed to an overemphasis in the academic community on intersectionality?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm sort of, I have a way of answering these questions. There are two ways to answer that question. On the one hand, there is a polysyllabic tendency. So intersectionality is a big word. The reality is that we've always dealt with that. I mean, in statistics, it's called multivariate analysis. You know, with regard to women, it was called triple oppression: race, class, and gender. I mean, you know, it's like Black people, race and class, nation and class. We've always dealt with, you know, the world is complex and you have to always deal with multiple things. The only question is, do you break it down? Do you make it real for people? And I think that's part of what was so magical about looking at Black intellectual history, is that Carter G. Woodson, Du Bois, you know, people would break it down. Frantz Fanon broke it down. And it mattered to us to take knowledge and relate it directly to our experience. Now, it seems to me that in Black studies, enrollments are really critical. They not only reflect us, they reflect the institution in general. And so we have to constantly fight for the kind of recognition in the institution. Because the institution sends messages: don't do this, don't do that. If you want a good career, stay away from those people. All of that kind of hidden discriminatory practice, really, we have to fight that. We have to be aggressive. And we have to communicate with the parents of our students. In other words, they have to know that Black studies is what their children need to live the kind of life they want their children to lead. In other words, I really don't like the way in which, for example, we have these new language terms like talking about racism as microaggression. Like, for example, if somebody writes on the wall, "You Black SOBs, get out of this campus," they call that microaggression. That's a racist attack. And so we have to help people understand that it's possible. It is actually possible for us to beat back racism. It's possible for us to make advances, but we can't do it when we're ignorant of ourselves. We have to be conscious and self-determining, but self-determination requires you have to have a self-determination. If you don't have a self, then whatever you're determining, you know, somebody else is involved in that. So self-determination involves self-understanding. And we have to convince our students, and that means we have to perform better. We have to inform them better. We have to help them understand our research. We have to help them understand the history that they will be part of wherever they go and however long they live. So intersectionality, it's always been there, but we have to break it down and make it real for people.
I think we have time for probably two additional questions.
Okay, that's great. So we do have a hand raised by Ade. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Greetings. Thank you. Thank you, doctor. What a wonderful talk. Oh my goodness, that fed me. You made a point about African American studies not being made from the diaspora, from the other side. That was an amazing point. I've never heard that mentioned before, and it struck me. Do you have any idea why you think it's economics, it's ignorance, and not ignorance in the mean way, but just not knowing that it's something that needs to, that's important, that will enrich that community also? Do you have an idea of why it's not coming from the other side? Thank you.
I think that it's the history, of course, is that the US government and all the colonial governments made a main emphasis to keep Black people separate. separate on the continent, and certainly separate from the diaspora. And when the connection was made, we got the Pan-African Congresses. When the connection was made, we got the Nkrumahs and the Azikaways and others who studied here and who therefore knew the connection intimately in terms of their own lives. And this, of course, included Padmore and Claudia Jones and the people from the Caribbean as well. But the reason why we need to have it on the continent so that people will understand this country and not simply aspire to be here uncritically. Because there's still people from the continent who come here, you know, without an understanding of what the Black experience is like in the US. And so, you know, that's an important aspect. But the other aspect is that you can't understand the African experience under colonialism until you can understand what was happening in Europe and the US. I remember being in Belgium, for example, and asking a cab driver, we're driving down this boulevard and all these big buildings and everything. I said, where did all this wealth come from? He said, oh, we're very smart people. We're very ingenious people. And, you know, well, you know, so you have to understand, you know, where did this all wealth go? Where's it still going? And so you need to study Europe. You need to study Europe and understand that and explain that even to the young Europeans so they understand the relationship. And we have to have that same experience. Now, there's a brother from Trinidad who's now the president of Howard. So I hope that, you know, we can have in the Caribbean, we can have African Americans from the US creating some institutional base so we can have that sharing, that understanding. And then the same thing is true on the continent. In other words, in Liberia and in Ohio, there's a common interest in rubber, in the history of it, and the companies that exploited what happened in Liberia. But there's no connection. The same is true in the Congo with uranium and all those places where the CIA is active. They need to be studying that, but they need to be studying us over here. And we need to have that level of cooperation. And I think you're right that we don't talk about this, but we have to challenge them. In other words, you can't just have the excuse that, well, we're busy or we're so poor that we can't do it. Now, there are people right now at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana at Legon that are trying to start something. I thought Mbeki in South Africa used the term African Renaissance. That possibly could include what we're talking about. But it's time for an African American Studies program. Now, a lot of universities send people over to Africa. So we are all now Bintus. We've all been to Africa. That's a new tribe, the Bintus. But if you took a certain amount of that money, we could have built Black Studies programs and established academic positions on the continent so that we would really have a serious global Pan-African Black Studies program, which we don't have now.
Right, understood. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Our last question comes from the chat. It says, are there any strategic alliances / pursuits possible now between HBCUs and I'm guessing they mean PWIs and institutions across the diaspora?
Well, you know, first of all, when I left the University of Chicago, I went to teach at Fisk University. And one of the experiences at Fisk was that I think Woodrow Wilson Foundation would send students to an HBCU to teach graduate students for a year or so. And what would happen is they would go to the campus, look around, see what they thought was wrong, and come up with the idea of what to do. And then people would sometimes allow them to do it, and then they would leave. And then people would go back to do it the way they were doing it anyway. So the HBCUs, like any other institution, change over time. And changing an institution is not just a 1, 2, 3 kind of a situation. It involves a lot of people. It involves institutional memory. It involves sustainability, et cetera. So right now, the HBCU is no longer the segregated institution that had dibs on the Black middle class. In other words, throughout the country, people would send their kids to Fisk or to Lincoln, where Sam Anderson, went there. Hey, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
So now the HBCU really has become more of a class-based institution. And we have to adopt what SOBU, the Student Organization for Black Unity, had. They had a program called Save and Change Black Institutions. And that change has to be, how can institutions reconfigure themselves to be part of the struggle to transform the possibility of the Black community, not simply a bridge into the mainstream middle class, or the bridge into becoming a Black professional, where the great achievement is how many people go to medical school, how many people go to law school, how many people go to business school, how many people, social work, there were professions. And you go from an HBCU into a mainstream institution like that. We have to really go back to, what is the original People's College? What was that? That was Charles Johnson at Fisk setting up a program in the community where students and faculty were in the community teaching. The same kind of program happened in Atlanta, it happened at Howard, et cetera. So we need to rethink what's happening at the HBCUs. Now, on the other hand, for example, at the Howard Economics Department, they've got several institutes. Like they have an institute called the Institute for the Study of Race and Wealth. That's a wonderful title for an institute. The question is, what are they really talking about? Are they uniting with the need of Black people to expose the expropriation of wealth and the way in which the billionaires in this country have gotten away scot-free like gangsters? Or are they holding out the possibility of Howard students becoming wealthy? In other words, we have to really talk about how the HBCUs have a special responsibility that is, in fact, and this is the real point here, in opposition to what mainstream academic institutions are all about. And that's the struggle. Mm-hmm. And that's been the struggle. Mm-hmm. To educate Black people in America has always been subversive. Because once you educate a slave, once you educate somebody who's being oppressed, then they're dangerous. And I think that's, we have to accept that. I want to be free. I think everybody in this discussion want to be free. Mm-hmm. And we know that the structures in this society don't want us to be free. Now, what does that leave us with? The need to struggle. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely.
I'm sure y'all don't necessarily want to hear this. I hope some people want to hear it because that's what you're already doing.
Yeah. No, it's correct.
It's
correct. Appreciate you so much. Fantastic. I just want to make an observation. You mentioned Sam Anderson. Sam is here. So he's a great soldier. We're really delighted to see him here. Shamaka Kieta is here, one of the great scientists of today. And I see Kasun Chikol, the publisher, is here. We have a wonderful group of faculty from Temple, including Kimani Nehusi, one of the great scholars on ancient Egypt, who teaches our courses on the Chikam, the language of Kemet. We have here Dr. Nadav, the great scholar of African womanism, whose latest book is Being Human Being, Transforming the Race Discourse, as well as her recent book on Afrocentric schools. We have here Also, Ronaldo Anderson, one of the leaders in the Afrofuturist movement, who's one of our faculty members. I've seen him. We have Timothy Welbeck, who is the director of the new Center for Anti-Racism Research at Temple. And I may have missed some other people, but I imagine, is Jabali here at all? I'm not sure whether he's here, but I thought I may have seen him. Okay, if I missed someone, I didn't mean to. I'm just delighted to see everybody here. We got a lot of our graduate students, and we have had about 60 people in the session. So it's been very wonderful. And we want to once again thank you, Professor Al-Kalamat, for your very fine presentation. And we hope to have you back again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine.